Everybody, we're glad you're here, and we're glad you are watching this day by television, our internet, our YouTube. We're glad you're here, and we wish you were here, but we are the real confirmation students of Gillespie County. Welcome, confirmation. So today, we are going to look at some very important folks, people who helped establish our faith. Particularly in the first part of class, we're going to learn about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Would you say those three names with me? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And would you say them one more time with me? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, these were kind of the founders, the ancestors of our faith, both for Jewish people and Christian people. And you learned about Abraham and his wife Sarah last week, and also Hagar, who had a child Ishmael. And they became the people, the ancestors of the Muslim folks. And Abraham and his wife Sarah had Isaac. And we're going to learn about Isaac, Jacob today. And then a little bit later, we're going to learn about the great-grandchild named Joseph. But first, would you pray with me? Please fold your hands, bow your heads, close your eyes. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you this day for this gathering. We thank you for our churches, and we thank you for the people here. Thank you for teachers and parents and brothers and sisters. And thank you now especially for our ancestors in faith, people who have brought to us your word. Help us to live each day for you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, great big word in the Bible that we've talked about many times before, last year and this year. Throughout the Bible, the big R word is relationship. Let's say relationship together. Relationship. Because that is what God is always wanting to do. God is always wanting to come not just to everybody in general, but to you and you and you. And God always calls specifically to specific people, and also to their families and to their friends. And so in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we find that the first ancestors of faith are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's say those three names again. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, these are folks that we can find in history, we can date. Abraham was around 1700 BC, and Isaac a little bit after that, and other folks, ancestors, came along up until the time of Jesus. So going way back to about 1700 BC, 1600 BC, that's when Abraham and Sarah were living. And God decided He was going to establish with them a covenant. Can anybody tell me what a covenant is? Yes, Mr. Miller.
Like contract.
All right, yes, that's a good word for it. Contract, any other word? Yes.
A promise?
Yes. It's a promise, a contract, a promise. You say that, for example, if I say, Cora, I need you to mow my grass and you'll mow the whole yard for $50, and she says, yes, I will, and that's the deal. She mows the yard, I give her $50. That's a contract, it's a covenant. That's the way God makes relationship. He establishes His relationship with us, only it's not just a bargain, it's not just a deal for money, but it is out of His love. So He came to Abraham and then to Isaac because He kept it going. He wanted the covenant to keep on going and going and going. So once He established it with Father Abraham, and we learned that song, didn't we, Father Abraham, last week? Good.
Yes.
Father Abraham, once He established it, He said it's going to be to your family, so the descendants are as many as the what? In stars in the sky, or the sands on the sea. So He established that with Abraham and Sarah, and He said it's going to keep on going. And there's going to be a line of His promise. And the first folks that we see are the people called the Israelites. And Abraham is the beginning. He's the first person. Abraham and Sarah are the first Israelites. They don't know that yet because they're not called by it until a guy comes along. One of their descendants will be named Israel. I'll tell you who that is a little bit later today. So we've got, and here's a picture that has been photoshopped. This was taken around 1700 BC, and this was taken around 1650 BC, and this about 1600 BC. And they just kind of photoshopped them together. Or maybe somebody drew them. I don't know. Maybe I just found those on the internet. I can't remember. But Abraham, the promise first made to Abraham, and then the promise, because God was going to be faithful to Abraham and Sarah and keep the promise going, then it went to his kid, their kid Isaac. And then Isaac is going to have Jacob, and he's going to have a twin, and something happens to the twin. I'll also tell you about that in just a little bit. But it's going to keep going. The promise keeps going because God's made the promise, and God always keeps his promises. And then in the next few weeks, we're going to see how God keeps that promise even 400 or 500 years after Jacob, when the people of Israel have gone down into Egypt. And Keisha's going to tell you today how they get into Egypt. And next week we're going to find them down in Egypt. And there's going to be a guy named Moses. And that's the biggest story in the Bible, is about Moses. And he leads them out of Egypt. But how did they get to Egypt? That's what we'll also find out today. How the people of Israel, who have this promised land called Israel, will one day get into Egypt and become slaves and have to be led out. And the way God knows, next week we're going to hear about a burning bush. Moses, 400 years after Jacob, Moses is out in the desert in Egypt, and he sees this burning bush, and God's talking. How's he going to know God? They've been away from the promised land for 400 years. God's going to identify himself. God's going to say, Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And throughout the Old Testament, that's how God keeps identifying God's own self. He says, this is who I am. I made a covenant long ago, and it keeps going. Today, as Christians, we're going to study a lot about the Jewish people in the Old Testament, how God made a covenant. As Christians, anybody know where God makes a covenant with us? Where would God make a covenant with us?
In baptism.
Oh, yes, excellent answer, most excellent answer. In baptism, God makes a covenant with each of us. And he says, I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my people. And that's basically the same covenant he kept making with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You are my God, or you're going to be my people, and I promise I'm going to keep being your God. So you'll remember last week, Abraham, and what was Abraham's wife's name?
Sarah.
Sarah, okay. And God first comes and makes the covenant with Abraham and Sarah. Now there have been some things that had happened before this, like you've studied some about God created people, and we know the people Adam and Eve, and we know Noah who made the big boat, but you can't pinpoint them in history. That's called prehistory. Genesis 1 through 11, where you hear about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah. There's no place in history that says it was in this year. But starting with Abraham and Sarah, we know the year, we know the place. And you learned last week, they came from a faraway land, and God said, I'm going to give you a new land, and you're going to have a new home, which will eventually become the land of Israel. And God made that covenant with them. Do you remember who their son was? Yes! Oh, okay. Sort of. Yes, good. There were two sons involved. First of all, Sarah and Abraham were like 100 years old, and God said they're going to have all these descendants. And so far, they haven't had a baby yet. And they are 90 and 100 years old. Yes? Isaac, yes. Those are the two boys. See what happened? Sarah and Abraham, remember, no kids. Where's God's promise? He must have forgotten us. So, Sarah gets this idea and says, well, Abraham, I can't have any kids. Bring in the maid Hagar. Okay? Yeah, she can be with you for the night, and maybe y'all can make a baby. Sure enough, they make a baby. And that baby's name is Ishmael. But God says, no, I made a promise to Abraham and Sarah. You're really going to have a kid. And Sarah laughed and said, I don't believe you. Sure enough, at age 90, Sarah gets pregnant. She has a kid. And his name is Laughter. In Hebrew, it's Isaac. But in English, it means laughter. And they named Isaac Laughter because Sarah laughed when she found out she was going to have a baby at age 90. And she wasn't sure she could believe God's promise, but sure enough, the promise of God, the covenant of God, kept going and going and going. So, Isaac gets married to a woman named Rebecca. They have the baby. Abraham and Sarah have baby Isaac, meaning laughter. And then Isaac finds a wife. And she's going to kind of take the place of Sarah. Abraham and Sarah have been the mother and father of all these Hebrew people, these chosen people, later called the Israelites. And now, Isaac, after Abraham and Sarah die, the son Isaac and Rebecca, they have twins. So we know the family promise is going to keep going because now there's more family on the way. They're going to have twins. Yes?
Does it ever say in the Bible that Isaac and Ishmael ever met?
Oh, that's a very good question. believe that they did. I'm going to have to look and find out. I'm thinking that they did, because now there was a time when Sarah gets kind of mad, and I can't remember if this was when Isaac was still a baby or if it was after he was older. But Sarah gets mad at Ishmael's mom, Hagar, because Hagar kind of looks at her like, I had the first kid. And Sarah gets mad, and so she sends Hagar and her little son Ishmael out into the desert. And so I don't think after that they ever saw each other again. I'll have to look that up though. I'll help me remember next week. I'll try to look that up, whether they actually knew each other when they were kids. I believe Ishmael was around 12 when he and his mom were sent out into the desert. But I can't remember how old Isaac was. So Isaac and Rebekah, they're going to have twins, and we are going to see a little movie about them, because these twins are going to, well, they're bumping each other already in the womb. They're fighting each other. They're going to have some conflict throughout their life. And Esau is going to come out of the womb first, so he'll be the oldest. He's really hairy, all right? He's hairy everywhere, all right? Esau is hairy. Jacob has really smooth skin. And they have two different kinds of jobs. And you're going to see how even though the promise should go on, in those days in the Bible, the oldest son would get everything. He'd inherit everything. He'd get the blessing from the father. But Jacob, by the word, oh dear, the word Jacob, it means tricky guy. All right, it means trickster. All right, and Jacob is always pulling tricks on Esau and everybody else. So watch the trick he pulls, because even though Esau's the oldest, and the oldest was supposed to get the blessing from his father, Jacob is going to get it.
Looks like waves. Oh my God.
Conniving.
Conniving, tricky, playing tricks.
God had promised to make Abraham and Sarah's descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as sands on the beach, and so on. Which seemed unlikely, as they had only one son, Isaac. However, things were looking up. Isaac's wife Rebekah was carrying twins, and energetic ones at that. The first son to come out of the womb was named Esau, which meant hairy, for obvious reasons. The second to emerge was named Jacob, or heel grabber, also for obvious reasons. These were the only children Isaac and Rebekah would have. Being the firstborn son came with a lot of perks. As part of your birthright, you were entitled to inherit a majority of the family's lands, livestock and possessions, as well as your father's status. Any siblings that came after the firstborn received significantly less. Jacob, the more quiet and delicate child, rarely left the comfort of the tents and thus chose to become a shepherd. Esau, however, became a hunter, as he was much more comfortable in the wilderness and had a somewhat less subtle personality. One day, Esau, having just returned from an unsuccessful hunt, was not in his best state of mind.
Hungry. Give me red stuff.
And Jacob did what any loving family member would do. He made Esau bargain for his food.
Red stuff, red stuff, red stuff.
Without even haggling, Esau gave Jacob his birthright for a bowl of red stuff. But since they were teenagers, and this is absolutely ridiculous, it might not have been legally binding. Isaac grew old and went completely blind, and so decided it was time to get his affairs in order. He called in Esau to give his son a final blessing. After Esau hunted down some tasty game for Isaac to eat. Coincidentally, Rebecca had been minding her own business directly outside the tent and overheard this. She then convinced Jacob to pose as Esau and steal his blessing, which, unlike a child's bargain over a bowl of soup, would complete the hostile takeover, making Jacob the patriarch of the family. Jacob certainly liked the sound of that. Isaac was suspicious, but upon closer inspection it felt like Esau, and it certainly smelled like Esau. And so, unwittingly, Isaac blessed Jacob, promising a large inheritance and passing on God's covenant to make the family's descendants as numerous as the stars.
That's me! That's me!
But it was irreversible. Isaac had nothing more to bless Esau with but the truth. He was now his brother's servant, for the amount of time that Jacob could survive Esau's attentive service. To save him from Esau's wrath, Rebekah quickly sent Jacob off to her brother Laban. Jacob had gained nothing through his tricks, save a perilous journey to live with an uncle he had never met. Before Esau and Jacob were born, God had told Rebekah that Jacob would rule over Esau. Given Jacob's current situation, this seemed unlikely. But on that night, in the depths of despair, God told Jacob it was still true, that God's covenant with Abraham resided with him. He made an altar, thanking God. However, now that he was fully awake, he did want to clarify the details of this relationship. Jacob was happy to worship the God of Abraham as his God, as long as God protected him, fed and clothed him, and eventually allowed him to peacefully return to his father's home. Jacob took God's silence to be an agreement to his terms. Jacob finally arrived in Hebron and immediately met his cousin, Rachel. It had been a long trip, and so naturally, it was love at first sight.
There you go. Water.
Jacob had nothing, so taking a wife was out of the question. He worked for Laban as a shepherd and showed that he had a knack for animal husbandry. After a month, Laban generously offered to start paying Jacob something for his labor.
So, what would you...
Rachel!
This was wildly inappropriate, almost like asking for someone's birthright in exchange for a bowl of red stuff. But this time, it was Laban who took full advantage. In order to marry Rachel, Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years. The wait was excruciating. And then, in the darkness of the wedding tent, Laban switched Rachel for her older sister Leah. Laban didn't mention, and Jacob didn't bother to learn, that it was tradition for the eldest daughter to be married off first. Jacob was furious and insisted on being allowed to marry Rachel. Laban conceded and let him marry Rachel a week later, in exchange for 7 more years of work. After those 7 years had passed, Jacob tried to leave, but Laban, aware he was blessed through Jacob, tried to keep him for as long as he could.
Think of the sheep.
5 years later, God told Jacob it was time to leave. Wary of Laban, Jacob left without saying goodbye. A smart man like Jacob would have settled somewhere far from Esau, but God told Jacob to return home. And Jacob, though scared, was now wise enough to listen. He had sent messengers ahead to tell Esau of his arrival in the area. Upon returning, they told Jacob that Esau was riding to meet him with a small army. Immediately Jacob prayed for help, then got to work. He sent a bribe to Esau, hid half of his family, and separated himself from the rest, so only he would face Esau's wrath. That night, he camped alone, just like the first night of his exile, only this time he was suddenly attacked. Jacob was not a young man, nor had he ever been particularly athletic, but he wrestled with the assailant all night. Just before the sun rose, his attacker tried to leave.
Let me go.
Not until you bless me!
Fine. Your name is now Israel.
It was a blessing and an observation. Jacob, heel grabber and supplanter, was now struggling for the benefit of others and had earned the double-edged name Israel, one who strives with God and shows himself ready to accept God's blessing. Esau had forgiven Jacob. He even invited Jacob to stay with him, but Jacob had learned caution and settled a reasonable distance away from his brother. Jacob, with his 12 sons, became the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel, and like his father, continued playing favorites.
I counted 12.
So, you had Abraham, you had his son Isaac, you have his grandson Jacob, and Jacob's name was changed to what?
Israel.
Israel. All right? And Israel literally means struggling with God. And ever since that day, the Hebrew people have been known as the Israelites. Because Jacob, did you catch at the end, how many sons did Jacob have?
12.
12. Had 12 sons. And let me show you just briefly.
Joseph.
There are the 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Joseph. Why do you think he's got this coat of many colors on?
Does it say coat of many colors?
Coat of many colors. Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali. There are 12 tribes of Israel. There will later, as the land develops and people grow, the 12 sons of Israel, each one will have a tribe. So they'll call them the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph will be the main guy. And a little bit later, Keisha's going to tell you the story of Joseph and how he gets them all into Egypt. And it's very good at first. By the way, 12 tribes of Israel. How many disciples did Jesus have later on? 12. Aha. There might be a connection. We'll learn that next year. Yes, sir.
I have a question about did he have babies? Did Jacob have babies with all those women?
Yes, Jacob had married 2 wives. Leah was the trick. The guy Laban played a trick on him, and he thought he was going to be marrying Rachel, he was in love with, but it turned out when they lifted up the wedding veil, it was really Leah, because the dad was trying to get rid of his daughter Leah. So, and then he had to work more years to get the real woman he loved, Rachel. So he had 2 wives, and then when one of them died, later he also married these 2 women, and it's from his 4 wives that he had the 12 sons.
Okay.
The 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to stop there. And Miss Keisha, what is our direction at this time?
Those of you who have to leave at 6, it's about 6 o'clock, and we are going to break into our small groups. And we'll meet back here at 6:15.
Good. Thank you very much.
Pastor Casey.
Yes, sir.
I need to find somebody